Hello everyone, it's Hoplite Mike. Today we are doing a faction guide and overview for the Dwarves of Erebor. I'm sure we all remember the Lonely Mountain from the Hobbit trilogy, when Thorin Oakenshield and his company set out to reclaim the mountain from the dragon Smaug. Lake Town is the city he destroys before being shot by Bard the Bowman. Thorin obviously dies during the Hobbit, so by the time of the War of the Ring, Erebor is ruled by Dane Ironfoot, who is also the dwarf that comes to Thorin's aid during the Battle of the Five Armies. His coronation as king is actually in the deleted scenes for The Hobbit. From a gameplay perspective, it's probably worth noting that in the original mod for Rome Total War Alexander, there was only one dwarven faction. So the Dwarves of Erebor, the Dwarves of Iron Hills, and the Dwarves of Eredluine were all combined into one faction called the Dwarven Clans. In the updated War of the Ring campaign for Rome Remastered, the Dwarven Clans has been split into the three aforementioned factions, so there will be a lot of similarities between them. But without further ado, let's get started on this. So first I'll cover the unique generals and characters, then how the economy works. Next it'll be how recruitment works, campaign strategy, and lastly a full showcase of the unit roster on the battlefield. I'll start with the unique characters and generals. As I alluded to before, the faction leader is Dane Ironfoot. He has a son called Thorin, which is obviously not the same Thorin from the Hobbit trilogy. Dane has a unique model, as we can see here. He also has a custom bodyguard, being the Dragon Slayers, which are one of the higher tier units the dwarves get access to. In terms of how strong this bodyguard unit is, it's probably more offensively based than what we would usually see. The defense of 21 on the base unit is at the lower end when you compare it to the generic bodyguard for the elves and dwarves. However, it does have solid attack and, importantly, an armor-piercing primary weapon, which means it ignores half the target's armor value. So you'll be able to rip your enemies to shreds with the Dragon Slayers. Moving on to Thorin, he has the generic model. He also has the generic bodyguard unit, being the Old Guards. So every general that spawns in after the start of the campaign for Erebor will have this model and this bodyguard unit. In terms of how strong this bodyguard is, this is much more what we would usually see. It's got very high defense of 28 on the base unit combined with the plus 3 hit points. It's very tanky, and then it has solid melee attack as well. But overall, this is a fantastic bodyguard unit that the dwarves have. So that's about it for the characters and generals. Next I'll move on to the economy. In this section I'm going to run through how the economy works. As you might expect, the dwarves make most of their money through mining. They are the only culture which get access to the full 4 tiers of the mine. Every other faction is capped at either tier 2 or tier 3. This means the dwarves are able to generate more income from the mining resources you find on the map compared to the other factions. In order to build mines in a settlement, it must either have the minerals resource or the ore resource, and you can see them on the map. So Erebor has both the minerals resource, which is this blue object here, and it has the ore resource. Some regions will only have minerals, and some might only have ore, but you can still build the mines in those regions. It's probably worth noting as well at this point that Moria is the only region in the game which has the mithril resource. So there are 3 mining resources in the game: minerals, ore, and mithril. Minerals are the most abundant. You'll see them more than you see the ore resource, and then there is only one region in the game which has mithril, which is Moria. The important thing to note about the differing mining resources is that the minerals only allow you to build the first tier of the mine. So if you have a region which only has the minerals resource, the blue object, and not the ore resource, then you'll only be able to build the surface mines, which will restrict your income in that settlement. In order to build beyond tier 1 of the mines, you need that region to have the ore resource, or mithril. So in terms of getting your economy going, it's a good idea to prioritize going for regions which have the ore resource, which generally are those in the mountains, like this settlement here, which has the ore, as well as Thorigsborg, which has ore. And then there's a number along the mountains in the north here, which also have the ore resource. Something to note also about the mines are that each mining resource will give you a separate revenue stream. So if we look at the mines which are built in Erebor, you can see we've got two streams of income. We've got the 1250 and the 900, and that's because the minerals and the ore give you a separate revenue stream. So for example, in Moria, because you have the ore, mithril, and the minerals, that'll give you 3 revenue streams. So this is an incredibly lucrative settlement to take if you're playing as the dwarves. So I think that's probably everything there is to say about mines. But mines are the backbone of your economy when you're playing as the dwarves, so it's very important to get them set up and take settlements where you can build mines. There's no better revenue stream when you're playing as the dwarves. There's also a second building called the Clan Meeting Ledger and Headquarters. If this is built in a region where you have the ore resources, that will give you some additional mining income as well. But this is more of a catch-all building. It gives you population growth, and as well as a tax income bonus. So I think that's everything there is to note about mines. Next I'll move on to the more traditional economy buildings that most of the other factions have. So in terms of markets, you're not restricted here. You get the full 5 tiers of the market. In order to build the market in a region, it must have hidden resource, dwarves, elves, men, or hobbit. And most of your surrounding regions will have either hidden resource men or dwarves, which means you'll be able to build the market in most places you conquer, so that is not a problem. In terms of ports, you only get access to 1 tier of the port, as is the same for the other dwarven factions, but you start very far away from the coast, which is the nearest place you can build ports, so that doesn't really affect you. As I already alluded to earlier, the dwarves don't get farms, so you can't build up your farmland and increase that farming income. However, the headquarters or the clan building tree we looked at before does give you population growth, which would otherwise come from the farms. So it's important to build this if you are looking for a bit more population growth. Luckily for the dwarves, they do get access to the full 2 tiers of the road, which is as much as any faction gets, so you're not restricted there. And that is quite important to get your armies to the front lines quicker. The trade income bonus isn't really that significant. It's more about the movement range. So I think that's all the buildings. The last one we didn't really go into much detail on was the Dwarven Management, which is the catch-all building. But this is a good sort of bonus building just to give you benefits in multiple areas. You got your population growth, increases to taxes, mining income, some trade income bonuses. So it's not really something you need to go for as a priority, but it's a nice building to go on top if you've built most of your other economy buildings. The last thing to note then is because you don't have farms, you are missing out on the population growth from that, and even though the Dwarven management buildings do give you a small bonus here, it's not significant, it's only 0.5%. So just bear in mind that if the settlement you're in has hidden resource dwarves, then the government building will give you population growth, but it scales down from 3% at tier 1 to 1% at tier 5. So just bear in mind that it's not always worth it to upgrade early. You might want to stay at tier 2, for example, just to get the extra percentage of population growth per turn, at least for a little while. But that's only for regions which have hidden resource dwarves, and generally that is the ones in the mountains, but they do have a distinctive look. So settlements which look like this at the beginning of the game generally are ones that have hidden resource dwarves. That's important for the economy and also for recruiting when we come to cover that in the next section. Obviously, as you take control of settlements and build them up, they will have a different look. So, for example, if the elves took control of this settlement and upgraded it, it would have an elven look, but at the start of the game, the regions which look like this are the ones that have hidden resource dwarves. So just bear that in mind. And yeah, I think that's everything for the economy, so next I'll move on to recruiting. In this section, I'm going to discuss how recruitment works. Now, just bear with me on this one, because the Dwarven recruitment system is one of the most complex in the game. So there's quite a few things to go through. Like with most factions, there are 2 core buildings, which give you access to most of your roster, being the barracks and the forge. For some factions, the barracks might give you access to your arch units, and then the forge will give you access to infantry. But for the dwarves, there's no real distinction between the two. They just give you access to different dwarven units, and the dwarven roster is full of melee infantry. They only have 1 skirmish unit from tier 1 of the forge, and then there's some other human units they can get outside of their dwarven regions, but I'll get onto that later. So I'll start with the barracks. The important thing to note about the barracks is that depending on the region of where you build the barracks, it will give you access to different units depending on whether that's a dwarven settlement or a human settlement. And I've taken control of some settlements to be able to demonstrate that. So you don't start with Uland in the north, but I've taken it for the purposes of this video. So Uland is a settlement which just has resources minerals, and it is a dwarven settlement because it's got the dwarven look, so it has hidden resource dwarves. If we look at the barracks in this location, you'll find that the militia barracks gives you your dwarven miners. The barracks, or the second tier of the barracks, adds on the dwarven axemen. The third tier adds on the vanguards, and the 4th tier adds on the halberdiers and the juggernauts. So the important thing to note about this is that if the dwarven region you've built the barracks in has the ore resource that we discussed before, which is here, it will give you access to units 1 tier early. So for example, in Erebor we do have the ore resource, so we'll see that the barracks gives us an extra unit early, so the 1st tier gives us the miners and the axemen. Tier 2 gives you the vanguards, tier 3 gives you the halberdiers, and tier 4 gives you the juggernauts. So essentially at each tier you're just getting a unit 1 tier early or 1 level early. So that's the dwarven side of things. In terms of if you have a settlement which has hidden resource men, which is just those that are inhabited by men at the start of the game, such as Dale and a lot of the rebel regions around here are inhabited by human bandits. So in those locations, and I've taken Lonsdale for the purposes of this video, this does have hidden resource men. This is a human settlement. and we'll see that this gives access to different units. So tier 1 still gives us the miner, but tier 2 gives us the hireling spearman, which is a human spearman unit. Tier 3 gives us the hireling archers, and this is the only archer you have access to in your entire roster, so it's quite important to take some of the regions which have hidden resource men to get archers. There's only one dwarven ranged unit, and that's a skirmish unit. It's not particularly strong, doesn't have big range, so you need these archers. And then additionally, if a region has lesser horses, which Lonsdale does, you'll be able to build tier 4 of the barracks, and that will give you access to the hireling horsemen. And again, this is the only cavalry unit that the dwarves have access to, so it's very important to conquer regions which have lesser horses to get some cavalry. And the closest ones to Erebor are Lonsdale. Fairlesgard does have horses, but they aren't lesser horses, so you can't get tier 4 of the barracks here and recruit cavalry, at least in this version. So that's most of the things to note with the barracks. So essentially it'll just give you different units depending on whether that settlement is dwarven or human, and then if it's dwarven and it has ore in the settlement, it gives you early access to your units 1 tier early. Something additional to note on the barracks then. So this probably isn't that relevant because it'll take a while to get out of this starting location. But tier 3 and tier 4 of the barracks do need you to have either hidden resource men or dwarves, and then tier 4 needs you to have hidden resource dwarves or lesser horses. So once you get out of this starting area, potentially move into Mordor, those locations obviously won't have hidden resource dwarves, lesser horses, or men, so you won't be able to build tier 3 and tier 4 of the barracks there. I think that's most of the things related to the barracks. Next, I'll move on to the forge. So again, the forge has some requirements as well. You can build the first 2 tiers of the forge anywhere, but to build the 3rd tier, you need that location to have surface mines, which is the first tier of the mines, and then to build tier 4, you need that place to have open pit mines, which is tier 2 of the mines. And what that means is that you can only build mines in a location which has mining resources. So you need the minerals resource in a location to get the first tier of the mines. So effectively, a requirement for having the 3rd tier of being able to build the 3rd tier of the forge is that you need to have the mineral resources, because otherwise you can't get the first tier of the mines. And then to get the open pit mines, which are here, you need that region to have the ore resource. So a requirement for building tier 4 of the forge is that that region needs to have the ore resource. So again, a lot of requirements for these. In terms of the units you get from the forge, so 1st tier will give you access to the dwarven warsmiths as long as that location doesn't have hidden resource men, so generally that's just in the dwarven regions, the elven regions, etc. It's the same for the 2nd tier, same requirements. And then the 3rd tier, there's no requirements on the units from here, but obviously you need the 1st tier of the mines to build the Royal Forge. And then likewise with tier 4, there's no requirements on the units here, but again you need the tier 2 of the mines to build tier 4 of the forge, so having ore resource in that settlement is a requirement to get these units. So that's the barracks and the forge in a nutshell. Essentially, what you want to do is you need to prioritize the settlements which have the ore resource anyway for the economy, and that will allow you to get your strongest dwarven units as soon as possible. And then it's a good idea to conquer Lonsdale as soon as possible so that you can get your cavalry, because otherwise the campaign becomes a bit more tricky if you don't have the cavalry. So in terms of other buildings, then, like with all the factions, they have their practice fields, ranges, blacksmiths, and training grounds, which just improves your light attack, heavy attack, armor, and missile attack. As the dwarves, you are very tanky. Almost all of their units, even the low-level units, have plus hit points. So I wouldn't say these upgrade buildings are that necessary, but you'll probably find in the later game that you do have some spare money, so it's never a bad idea. Just don't build them in a place where you're dependent on for money, because it gives you a tax penalty. So usually I just build that in one of the non-mountainous settlements, because the mountainous settlements is where you make all your money through mining. With all that being said, I'm now going to move on to campaign strategy. In this section, I'm going to discuss campaign strategy. As Erebor, you obviously start with one settlement, and while it is a good settlement in terms of income, it's not enough to support multiple armies. So we need to get that economy going, and I would recommend going for the settlements which have hidden resource dwarves and also the mining resources, because that will allow you to get your best troops earlier, and it will allow you to bring in that mining income, so you've got a decent revenue. So the best settlements to go for are these ones in the north here. You've got Gondomegblom and Thorigsborg. Both of them have hidden resource dwarves because they've got this dwarvish look. A lot of the regions in the mountains do have hidden resource dwarves, but you can also tell them just by the way they look at the start of the campaign. Ulund here in the north also has hidden resource dwarves, but it's only got the minerals resource, so it's not as financially beneficial. So if you take these two settlements here, you'll be able to build up to tier 4 of the mines, and you'll be able to recruit your better units from the barracks earlier, like we discussed in the recruitment section. It is also important to note that each mining resource will give you a different revenue stream. So if a settlement has minerals and ore, like Erebor does, it's got the minerals here and ore, then you'll get 2 revenue streams from the mines. So you've got the 1250 and the 900 there. So if you are trying to decide which settlement to go for, the ones which have both mining resources are the best ones to go for. After that, the next best ones to go for are the ones which just have the ore resource, because you'll be able to get tier 4 of the mines, and then the ones after that would just be the minerals resource. But that's the best way to get your economy going. Just head north, pick up these 2 settlements, and then some of the regions along the mountains here also have the ore resource, so they're good ones to go for. So after that, I should probably talk about your strategic direction. So as Erebor, you need to take certain settlements and also hold 30. Most of the settlements you need to take are in the west here, so Gundabad, Kidrol Sin, and Moria are in these areas here. So Gundabad's here, Kidrol Sin is here, and Moria is here. So your sort of natural direction to meet your objectives is to head west along these mountains and then south. So that means that you don't really want to be dealing with scuffles in the east here. So what I would recommend is let the Dwarves of the Iron Hills expand. Don't start taking rebel regions off them, just let them expand how they want to expand, because they'll be your buffer to the Eastlings. It's the same with Dale, let them try and expand, although Lonsdale is not a bad settlement to take because it does have the less horses. That's the closest place where you can get the cavalry currently. There are horses in Fellis Guards, but they are the horses resource as opposed to lesser horses, so you can't get tier 4 of the barracks here. But that might change in future versions. This guide is for version 1 of the mod. So yeah, I think that's your strategic direction, getting the economy going. It's probably worth noting as well that by the time you get to Kidrol Sin, the Orc Rabbles will have massively multiplied. They usually have multiple full stacks. It's very easy for them to generate armies because their units only take one turn, and they just sort of spill out of the mountains and start taking loads of regions. So they're a bit of a challenge to deal with when you get there. So just make sure you bring enough troops down there, and then it's the same for Moria, although you do have the Galadrim Elves next to you, so that's not usually as bad as Kidrol Sin. And yeah, I think that's your campaign strategy in a nutshell. So just prioritize the settlements which have the ore and minerals resource. The ore resource is the ones you really want to go for over the minerals, but the ones which have both will be the most financially beneficial. Try to take one still, take some of these settlements just so you can get your archers and the cavalry units. It'll help against the goblins. And yeah, sometimes the Orc Rebels do have troll units, as do Gundabad, so it's quite important you get your archers for those. And as before, you need the regions which have hidden resource men to get your archers, which is usually just the ones in this sort of area. I think Fellasgard has hidden resource men actually, so you can get your archers there. But yeah, that being said, I'll now move on to the unit roster showcase. In this section, I'm going to do a full showcase of the units. The roster is generally characterized by very tanky melee infantry. All the dwarven units, even the low level ones, have plus hit points, so they are very tough to kill. There are some limited ranged options with the axe throwers and the archers, and then you've got one cavalry unit being the hireling horsemen. I should note that the 3 units on the end here are not dwarven units, they are human units, but they are still recruitable by Erebor. You just can only get them from regions which have either hidden resource men or less horses. They're not as strong as the dwarven units in that they don't have the plus hit points, and their stats are not that great, but it's the only way to get archers and cavalry, so they still perform a role in the campaigns. But with all that being said, let's start going through the units one by one. I'll start with the Dwarven Miners, which are the most basic melee infantry. You can get these from tier 1 of the barracks. They cost 450 gold and then 150 per turn. They're not bad in the early game. The melee attack is decent and the defense of 12 looks a bit on the low side, but they do have plus hit points, which make them a bit more tanky. It's not a unit I usually go for just because it takes 3 turns to recruit, and there are better options from tier 1 of the barracks if that settlement has the ore resource. So usually I just go straight for the Dwarven Axemen rather than the Miners. But they do serve a purpose in that they are the only unit that is recruitable from a settlement which doesn't have hidden resource dwarves or ore in the early game, tier 1 of the barracks. Next we have the Dwarven Axemen. You can also get these from tier 1 of the barracks if that settlement has hidden resource dwarves and the ore resource. They cost 590 and then 200 per turn. These are the units I use as the backbone of my armies for most of the campaign, because you can get them fairly early on. They only take 2 turns to recruit, and the stats are good enough that they can live with the mid to late game units of the other factions during your campaigns. Then we have the Dwarven Vanguards. You can get these from tier 2 of the barracks if that region has hidden resource dwarves and the ore resource, otherwise it will be tier 3. These are basically just an upgrade over the Dwarven Axemen. They have slightly higher defense and attack, and slightly improved morale, but they do have 18 less men, so usually I just stick with the Axemen. Then we have the Dwarven Halberdiers. These come from tier 3 of the barracks if the settlement has hidden resource dwarves and the ore resource, otherwise it is tier 4. These are your best spear units. They cost 780 and then 260 per turn. The defense of 24 is respectable, and then the melee attack of 5 is definitely on the higher end for a spear unit. So against monster units and cavalry, they can be quite effective. Just bear in mind they do take 3 turns to recruit, so it's not a unit I usually go for. Usually if a unit takes more than 2 turns to recruit, I wouldn't get it unless it's a proper elite tier unit. Then we move on to the Dwarven Juggernauts, which are a Berserk unit. They come from tier 4 of the barracks. They cost 1070 gold and then 360 per turn. These are more of a specialist unit. I'm sure we're all aware of the Berserk units from the Rings Total War base game. They're essentially very offensive units. The melee attack of 9 is very high, combined with the charge stat of 8, so these will do a lot of damage. Just bear in mind they take 4 turns to recruit, so it's not a unit I usually go for, it's just a kind of fun unit to use in the late game of a campaign. Then we have the Dwarven Warsmiths, which are axe throwers. They are one of only 2 skirmish units when you include the hireling archers. Like you would expect, the missile attack is very high, but then they have a low range and a low amount of ammo. So you're not going to get much out of them, but they can do a job in melee combat because the defense combined with the plus 2 hit points isn't that bad, and their melee attack of 4 is in line with an early game unit, but all around they are a decent unit. Then we have the Dwarven Enforcers, which come from tier 3 of the Forge. These cost 970 gold and 320 per turn. These are basically your best standard melee infantry. They're better than the Vanguards and the Axemen in terms of their attack and defense, but they do take an extra turn to recruit. So, as I said before, I usually just stick with the Axemen because they have the highest number of men, and that does help when you're fighting against the Goblins because they can have up to 200 to 240 men a unit. So, I usually go for the increased numbers over the stats, but these are your best standard melee infantry. Up next we have the Dragon Slayers, which come from tier 4 of the Forge. These are more of a late game unit that you've probably only used once you've won your campaigns. The defense of 21 doesn't look that good for an elite unit, but then again it does have plus 3 hit points as opposed to plus 2, which most of the dwarves have. So it is still very tanky. And then importantly, it's got the armor piercing primary weapon combined with a decent melee attack. So they will ignore half the target's armor value, which is useful against units that have high armor, like monsters and the Eastlings, for example. But all around, this is an excellent unit with a slightly reduced unit size. One to use late in the campaigns if you want to have some fun. They do take 4 turns to recruit as well, which means it takes a long time to get them. But again, a very solid unit overall. Then we have the Old Guards, which is the generic General's Bodyguard for Erebor. This is very similar to the Elven General's Bodyguard. They just have very high defense combined with plus 3 hit points, so very tanky, and then a solid melee attack. All around, it's a fantastic General's Bodyguard. I'd say the Elves and the Dwarves have the best General's Bodyguards in the game. Then we have 3 human units, the Spearmen, Archers, and the Horsemen. You can get these from a barracks in a region which has hidden resource men, which is generally just those inhabited by men at the start of the game. None of the units are particularly strong. The Spearmen are markedly worse than the Halberdiers, but you can get them earlier than the Halberdiers, so they do have a use. The Hireling Archers are the only archers which the Dwarves have access to, and in terms of stats, this is about as bad as it gets for an archer unit. The missile attack of 9 is very low. I can't think of any archer units which have missile attack lower than 9, and then the missile range of 120 is also on the lower end. I think the Orc Archers are the worst, and they have a range of 110. And then again, the defense and attack are so low they can't really do much in melee combat, but they are actually quite important in campaigns because you need archer units to deal with the trolls of the Orc rabbles and Gundabad when you get there, so they do have a role in your campaign, but just bear in mind they're not the best as archer units. Then lastly we have the Hireling Horsemen, which are the only cavalry which the Dwarves get access to. You can get these from tier 4 of the barracks in a region which has the lesser horses resource. like with the archers, the cavalry are nothing special. They're probably a bit better than a low tier unit. The defense of 16 is on the lower end. Even mid tier cav has defense of around 19 or 20, but the melee attack of 7 is quite good. The charge of 2 is a bit on the low side as well. But if you want to have cavalry as the dwarves, then this is the only option you've got, so it's worth recruiting them anyway. That's going to be it for this one. I hope you enjoyed the faction guide and overview for Erebor, and I will see you on the next one.